Right, guys. So as we kind of wrap down or wind down this chapter on federalism, I want to make sure I'm covering some of the other sort of loose threads of this particular unit that are likely to show up on the AP exam. Federalism as a concept will stick with us for most of the year, and you'll find me just saying, like, it's federalism, all right, probably 57 more times. But as far as like the basic understanding or what you need to know, I hope to wrap that up in today's lecture um, to kind of get through everything that could possibly show up on the AP exam. So obviously this graphic right here really symbolizes our federalism model of government pretty well, which is multiple levels of government. Obviously, one U.S. federal government, 50 state governments. But then you start looking at all the different local, county, city, town, school districts, etc. And federalism is kind of the overlap and interplay of all of these, right? And so today in class, we really already looked at this. So I'm not going to spend any time looking at the significance of McCulloch v. Maryland, right? We know that it created implied powers, right? That basically the Constitution has more powers given to the federal government than simply the ones you can point to. It also created the Supremacy Clause, right? So I'm not going to go into this, right? They use the necessary and proper clause to justify implied powers and to argue for it, which is why the necessary and proper clause came to be known as the elastic clause, because it can stretch to allow a lot of different things to happen. But today I really want to pick up on this next one, which is a really good example of a case and how the Supreme Court works, where a relatively small and simple and on its surface pretty boring looking case can end up having huge, right, constitutional implications that changes the course of the entire country. And so this here is the case of Gibbons v. Ogden, which I hope that you got in last night's federalism court cases thing. I found that the Oyez explanation was pretty hard to follow, but the Bill of Rights Institutes was much easier. But let me just kind of quickly go through the story, because I think it's a great story of how something woefully insignificant seeming can actually have huge implications. And so, on the surface, basically it is a federalism case because it's a conflict in power between the federal government and the states. And so the story is that Ogden, a man by the name of Aaron Ogden, had secured a business license from the state of New York to operate his like paddle boat, that river boat, the steamboat that you see in the picture to the left. And so Ogden had this license from New York that he was allowed to operate his steamboat on the waters that separated New York and New Jersey. And so along comes Gibbons, Ogden's former business partner, who basically, after splitting from Ogden, secured a similar license to operate steamboats from the federal government. And so Ogden, Gibbons rather, when Ogden and the state of New York shut him down, filed suit, basically saying, right, like asking the court to decide who exactly has the power to issue licenses on waterways that span between states, right? So take, for example, the Mississippi River. Who does the Mississippi River belong to? Right? The Mississippi River runs through like 14 different states. So it's an interstate waterway, as would most rivers in our country, right? There's very few rivers that would start in one state and then just end in that same state. It would be a different story if that was the case. But most rivers kind of span between states, and so therefore, by definition, are interstate waterways. And so the suit was filed, and basically, what it ended up doing in the Supreme Court ruling for this case. Congress's commerce power was established. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Gibbons, who had received the license from the federal government, and basically said that the only person or group, rather, the only level of government that was able, right, to issue licenses or regulate commercial activities on interstate waterways was the federal government. Now, as I already said, the court can't just decide whatever they feel like or whatever they think is the right answer. They must use the Constitution. That is the bounds of federal courts. The Constitution gives them the key to solve the problem. And so to solve this problem, the Supreme Court really fixated on basically the line in the Constitution that broadly said that Congress has the power to regulate national commerce, right? That regulates the economy. Congress, the federal government, has the power to regulate the national economy under the commerce power, right? And so if you backwards apply the previous McCulloch v. Maryland decision of implied powers, right, then we look at and say in the necessary proper clause, we look at and say, well, if Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce, then that implies that only they are the ones who are going to be able to regulate activities on anything that spans between states, because that is the, broadly speaking, the national economy. And so this decision by the Supreme Court greatly strengthened the federal government's ability to regulate anything that could have an impact on the national economy, right? Anything interstate is the national economy. So anything that runs between states and is an economic activity that spans the nation would be considered interstate. And so if Congress is the only one that can regulate that, then the federal government's power rose enormously. And actually, the commerce power has been used probably 1,000+ times in courts to argue that the US Congress and the federal government are allowed to do something, right? And I gave the example of the EPA. Well, the EPA and the creation of the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, and the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and all of these other bureaucratic agencies, it's the commerce power that has given Congress the right to create these, right? There's nothing in the Constitution that says that, federal government regulates the environment, but the environment has been seen as, if you by regulating the environment, you're regulating the conditions for the economy, right? That clean water and clean air and lead paint standards and all the different children's toy regulations and all of that stuff is pretty critical to the national economy, and so Congress can regulate it. And so the commerce power has been an enormous expansion of the federal government's powers, right? If you can suddenly regulate anything that has to do with business between the states, then Congress is the only one that can regulate the internet and insurance and radio signals and, car production and things like that. And so, like I said, when you combine this with McCulloch v. Maryland, right, that basic and the creation of the necessary and proper clause, then broadly Congress's power to promote economic development or regulate the economy is enormous. And so, the commerce power has been used by the federal government to create subsidies, right? The federal government will choose to subsidize our oil industry or farming industry and saying, hey, if dairy farmers really were to charge enough for a gallon of milk in order to make a profit, they'd probably have to charge like $7.50 a gallon to make a profit, right? You got to buy the cows, you got to care for the cows, veterinary care and antibiotics and all the different facilities you need for milking and the pasteurization equipment and all that. If you added all that up, in order for dairy farmers to actually profit on a gallon of milk would have to cost like $7. But the federal government has looked at that and said, hey, yeah, we don't want the milk to cost $7 because if it did, nobody would buy it and that whole industry would go out of business and all these people would be out of work. And we think the American people deserve cheap milk. And so Congress passed a subsidy that basically says, okay, dairy farmers, here's your subsidy. You can charge $3 per gallon, which basically means the federal government will pay $4 per gallon in order to keep the cost of milk low. And that's an exaggeration, but that's how subsidies work, right? And providing government services for business. Those of you who have, ever gotten a job at Taco Bell or Sonic or any other place, you probably had to watch a video in your training that dealt with workplace safety. I remember when I was, first getting my job at Home Depot, I watched a video of a man in a restaurant basically slipping on a floor and pouring hot soup all over themselves, or falling off a ladder while trying to change a light bulb. Maybe you've seen these videos. That's OSHA, right? That's the Occupational Safety Hazard Administration. Congress established OSHA through the commerce power, basically saying, hey, we have the ability to create this because OSHA is needed, right, to provide services for business and regulate basically economic activity. And so, in general, the commerce power has been stretched and grown over the years. The Commerce Clause, kind of formalized in this Gibbons v. Ogden, this dumb little steamboat case, came to be the case that broadly gave Congress such enormous powers to regulate all things dealing with the economy that, America's never gone back. It's fundamentally different because over the years this has grown to basically give Congress the power to regulate the entire economy in general. Safer working conditions, child labor laws, minimum wage, all of those things have been sued, right? Like states file suit when the government passed a minimum wage law and they said, hey, we don't think you can do that. Um, where in the Constitution does it say that you can pass a minimum wage law? And Congress says, well, it doesn't, but the necessary and proper clause. And we have the ability to regulate all things related to the national economy, and minimum wage laws that are that. And so, courts have largely sided with this defense, and that the use of the commerce power has greatly expanded federal government power over the states. That being said, there obviously are some cases, I'm thinking of US v. Morrison and US v. Lopez, that basically said, bad Congress, bad, right? Like you've gone far enough. You can't use the Commerce Clause to pass a no guns in school zones law. That's a stretch. Or you can't use the Commerce Clause to pass a Violence Against Women Act. That's a stretch. And so even though the Commerce Clause has grown in power and significance, there have been numerous case laws that are establishing boundaries of this power and saying that's far enough. We may give you a lot of power to regulate the economy, but you can't use it for everything. And so, maybe at the end of this slide, I want you to think of an example of something in the United States economy or United States in general that Congress has the power to regulate, um, probably through its like Commerce Clause power. I don't want you to use any of the examples of that I gave in this slide, but I want you to think about other things that you've heard of or seen that Congress regulates, passes laws on, and has the right to do it because of the Commerce Clause established in Gibbons v. Ogden. And so you go ahead and pause to answer that question. Okay. All right, so now we've already talked about how like states relate to the federal government under a federalism model, but we haven't spent much time talking about how, because they live in a federation of 50 states, how do states relate to each other under federalism? And so for this, we're going to really focus on three major points. Obligations that states have to each other that have been strengthened and reinforced by the courts. And so, under a federalism model, plain and simply, states have to engage with each other. They can't function as islands. It's not an every man for himself thing, right? Like when Colorado basically legalized marijuana, right? Kansas sued us and said, "Hey, we have all these people coming over the border to buy marijuana in Colorado, right? That's not okay." And so this kind of interaction between states happens all the time because states have to deal with each other too. They're in a union. And so let's look at the big three ways we're going to focus on. And so the first obligation we're going to look is something called the full faith and credit clause. This is Article 4 in the Constitution that pretty much expressly says that anything that you do in another state that's legal and creates a legal record, like a contract or a purchase or something like that, must be recognized in other states. So, for example, if I wanted to have a getaway marriage and I wanted to fly to Hawaii and get married in Hawaii, right? What would guarantee that I come back to Colorado and Colorado doesn't say, "Hey, we don't recognize Hawaiian marriages," and that would be the full faith and credit clause that I entered into a legal contract in the state of Hawaii, and that legal contract has to be honored in other states too. It's what basically stops people from basically saying, I'm gonna sell my car to somebody in New Mexico. right? And the person from New Mexico comes up here, pays me for the car, and